Greetings, sailors, and welcome to a few thoughts on the carrier rework. And it's a bit of a busy time at the moment in warships. We've had a new line of destroyers that's just come out. There's a whole bunch of premium ships and reward ships in testing. There's all the Halloween stuff, including submarines. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the carriers being released into the wild-ish. And I say ish because there's been an invite public beta test server thing, which all of us community contributors got to play on as well. And although it is still in a reasonably early state, we can at least start to see what Wargaming is going for in terms of how they want carriers to work. Now, it's not all great. I think some parts are good, some parts are definitely improvement on current carrier gameplay, but there are some definite downsides that I think they're going to have to address before this is released for real as well. And one thing to absolutely bear in mind, and I've got some footage going on in the background here as well, is that the entire purpose of this round of testing was to make sure that the actual plane control scheme feels okay. The way you control your aircraft squads and attack ships, because AA and damage and all the rest of it is absolutely not balanced right now. That wasn't the purpose of this test. So there was a lot of feedback, I'm sure, about how AA doesn't really do much and some of the captain's skills don't seem to really do much, and etc, etc. But that wasn't really the purpose of this test. It was to make sure that the plane's controlled correctly and that everything more or less worked. And I say more or less because it was a test server, and there were some resets and restarts, and I'm sure they had some crashes and stuff on their end as well. Heck, the amount of time it took for us to actually get to try this current version was delayed by a fair amount because they had to keep fixing things. They kept having horrible instability problems. So this is, this is a fairly big mechanical change in terms of how the game works and in terms of how the client works. So it's definitely still a little bit rough around the edges, but just so we're all on the same page as to the limited nature of this test. So we're going to start this off with stuff that I liked. I'm basically cribbing from my own feedback notes that I gave to Wargaming here, and that was the order we did stuff in. Stuff that we liked, stuff that we didn't like, and stuff that we felt could be changed. The biggest overall change is obviously that direct first-person control, and in some ways it is more involved, especially when you are attacking enemy ships. Your planes split off two at a time, go on the attack runs, and you've got to line things up just right. And I think that the difficulty level of actually aiming and landing the damage for the different types of attack craft that you have, because there's now one extra type of attack craft, that feels pretty good. That actually feels just about spot on. The different types of damage as well are better against different targets. You've got your rockets that are very good at stripping AA and will sometimes set fires, but the overall damage output isn't very good. Bombs are kind of reasonably good against everything, although quite hard to aim against destroyers. And then your torpedoes, well, battleships are by far the easiest targets to hit with those, but if you can land them on cruisers and destroyers as well, you're going to do all right. You're going to get a fair whack of damage, just like you can with torpedoes currently. But the downside of having just that single squad to shepherd is that you spend quite a lot of time just flying to your targets, and previously you at least would have been able to have more of a strategic awareness of what's going on, if I can put it that way, around the rest of the map, because with fighters that was also an important part of what was going on. But that was one of the ways they wanted to level the playing field, is to take player controlled fighters out of the equation. So again, that's a positive and a negative thing. So you've got this large amounts of downtime essentially, and especially with the tier 6 planes, which were slower than the tier 10 planes for obvious reasons, it was kind of boring at times. Now, I've mentioned fighters, and as I said, you can't control them directly anymore. They basically exist as a consumable. The positive part of that is that there's no more battle for air control. You're not going to get one player absolutely steamrolling another player in terms of taking down their planes. That's one of the big imbalance factors that can happen with current carrier gameplay. One of the reasons why a carrier can just absolutely dominate a match like no other class of ship can. And I suppose you can make the argument that, yeah, that's kind of historically appropriate, but from a gameplay perspective, if you're on a team with a carrier player who's much less skilled than an enemy carrier player and they're just absolutely dominating things, the match ends up being a foregone conclusion, and nothing that you do as a player is going to end up changing that. So that's one of the things they want to change, and taking fighters out of the equation for players kind of does that. But at the same time, it means you can't actually protect your own allies at all. And it also contributes to this feeling of there being a lot of downtime while you're flying your planes to target. You don't have to fly them back anymore, they do that automatically. You just zip back to your carrier and select the next squad for takeoff. But then you've got to fly them all the way to wherever you want to go. So yeah, that part is a bit less engaging right now, a bit less fun. So that's something they do need to work on. But I mean, overall, I kind of like the idea underlying it, that they just want to make it more about attacking enemy ships. And in a way, that does level the playing field, but it also doesn't totally remove the skill element, because as I've said, I think actually dropping your ordnance on ships is reasonably good right now in terms of the control scheme, how it feels, and how you have to line everything up and account for people trying not to get hit. But that does still require some skill. It's not like now where you've got manual drops and auto drops. Everything is directly under the control of the player. And so player skill absolutely will still count for that much at least. So a skilled player will still be out damaging an unskilled player. But an unskilled player won't be getting steamrolled by a skilled player the same way. If that makes any sense. At least that's how it seems to me at the moment, and it seems like that's what wargaming is going for. I've already mentioned a couple of things I don't really like. I mean, some of the things have been upsides and downsides at the same time, positives and negatives. With fighters especially, I think there is still some scope for players having control over their fighter squads. I think the removal of the role of carriers in terms of protecting their own team entirely isn't necessarily a good thing. You can fly your attacking squad near somebody else's squad and trigger the fighter, or you can just trigger it over some friendly ships and it will, I think it hangs around for a little while, is how it currently works. But you've got a very limited number of those fighter consumables, and if you're directly taking your squad to intercept somebody else's squad, they're just going to trigger the fighter right back at you, and both squads are probably going to mutually annihilate each other. So I mean, that could be a valid tactic, is you take your fastest type of plane, which is usually the rocket planes, and just use it to intercept another squad. But that comes at the cost of them being able to go and attack and do damage yourself. So one of the things I would like to see is some limited form of fighter support that the carrier player has more control over. Either being able to designate fighters over a specific ship, or else designate fighters to patrol a specific area. So not having them directly under player control, but having them be more of a factor than they are at the moment. There's definitely a deficiency there in terms of this new style carrier gameplay, and it would give you something to do in between flying your squads around the place, which, as I've said, is a tremendous amount of downtime right now. and one of the more fun-sucking factors that does exist. There are some other definite disadvantages as well from the perspective of somebody who is just in an ordinary surface ship. You can basically have the same type of squad sent after you, wave after wave. So if somebody decides, let's say you're in a battleship, somebody decides you're going to die, they can just send squad after squad of torpedo bombers after you. With the current implementation, there isn't even aircraft complement anymore. It's just infinite planes. I don't know if that's going to follow through to the final version, but even if that was the same, even if you never had to worry about running out of planes as a carrier, I still feel like there should be some kind of cooldown, that you shouldn't just be able to spam the same type of aircraft squad over and over again. And this was especially a thing with the Tier 10 ships. The Tier 10 carriers, or the Tier 10 torpedo bombers, just absolutely wreck Tier 10 battleships, because the battleships cannot maneuver. It was actually easier for the Tier 6 ships and even battleships to maneuver to try and throw off the torpedo bombers, because the longer they're having to maneuver and line up to actually make a drop on you, the longer they have to stay in your AA. And once AA is properly balanced, that might make more of a difference. But currently, yeah, I actually found it way easier to do damage at Tier 10 just by sending out wave after wave of torpedo bombers against battleships who just couldn't get out the way. Probably my last big current issue at the moment is that, well, it's kind of several that are grouped together. You can't control the carrier at all when you're controlling the individual plane squads, up to and including you can't use your heal or your damage control party or any other abilities you might have that they might yet implement. That's a big issue. You have to recall your planes, you have to abort your attack to be able to get back to controlling your carrier. Nobody liked that as a thing. Absolutely nobody was in favour of that. So at the very least, being able to control your carrier's path from the minimap and being able to trigger your damage control party or heal would be a necessary minimum. Being able to maybe do more things via the minimap when you're in control of your plane squads would maybe also be quite good, depending on if they do things with fighters, which I feel like they should. If you could control where you want fighters to be deployed on the minimap whilst you're in control of your attack squads, you know, I think that would be quite nice as well. That would minimise the amount of time of having to go back and forth between recalling planes and sending out planes, because there's not a lot to do at the moment. You know, I keep going over this point, but there's not a lot to do except use your speed boost to try and get your attacking planes there faster. And there's even a disparity between the speed boost for different nations, which was a bit, it was a bit, I don't know, I feel like there's one of those things they might use for national flavour, but I'm not necessarily sure they should. So what comes off of that is that currently it is quite easy to carrier snipe. There weren't any defensive AAs on the Tier 10 carrier, the Midway. There's no kind of replacement for it, especially. So I feel like if it came out right now as is, carrier sniping would absolutely go back to being a major issue. Carriers would start off just trying to snipe each other from, the entire map away, and whoever won would then, their team would then have a major advantage in terms of the carrier being around to inflict damage on the enemy team. It wouldn't really be about the air control anymore, but it would still be about doing lots of damage and not having any contest to that from the other side. So they either need to bring back defensive as a thing. Certainly, as I've said, you need to be able to have some form of control over your consumables or your carrier whilst you're playing the actual squads. But I maybe feel like even if they don't want to bring back defensive AA for carriers, at least let them have some kind of a combat air patrol or some form of automatic fighter escort that is just always around your carrier. Well, like I say, have it be a consumable, and you trigger it, and there are planes around your carrier that defend you for a while. If something like that isn't done, it's just going to go back to the bad old days of carrier sniping, and it will force wargaming to do something eventually. So I'm really hoping that's addressed. Lastly, some concluding thoughts. I still feel like right now carriers have, especially at high tiers, in this new form, even with only having one squad up at a time, just the way everything works, carriers still have an absolute potential to dominate a game damage-wise, especially in the hands of a skilled player that is able to line up their drops well. A big question mark, though, is how is AA going to look once they've balanced this? And also, how is it going to look once damage output's been balanced as well? Because this isn't necessarily how things are going to be in future, but if it was to come out right now, yes, carriers would still be absolutely dominating in terms of damage. But given that their overall goal is to get a bit more mass appeal into the carrier class, I think in that regard it's better than it is right now. I don't know how appealing it's necessarily going to be to the average player, but from my perspective as a complete scrub at the current way of playing carriers, I mostly only play carriers in operations, basically. It's a bit more involved, it's a bit more engaging, but I don't think I can sit down and play carrier game after carrier game in the same way that I could do so with, say, destroyers. Sometimes I get in the mood that I just want to play destroyers or I just want to play battleships. I feel like that would be unlikely with the current implementation of carriers, but it's the kind of thing where I could see me playing them much more often in random games, but it still wouldn't be that often overall. So if they're hoping to bump the carrier population up to be on a par where there's a carrier in every game, I don't know if they've entirely succeeded in that with this new vision for carriers, but certainly there will be more carriers around overall. I think that there will be more people encouraged to try out carriers and to play them more often and to give them a go. So I like overall the direction, but yeah, there are definitely some elements that would need to change before this came out. But I will be really curious to see in the following rounds of testing how it looks when we have more balanced AA, when we have more balanced damage output. Because I don't think the damage output in particular that's not going to be final. That's definitely not going to be final. So that was some rather rambling thoughts on the current state of carriers as they're being tested. You can add your own thoughts below. Maybe some of you got to play on the test server and try it out firsthand, or maybe you've just seen other people's videos. But yeah, as I say, I'm kind of cautiously optimistic, but I don't think this is going to set anybody's hair on fire in terms of making them massively enthusiastic about carriers. I'm sure there'll be some people that absolutely love this new style of gameplay, but then there are some people that absolutely love the current style of gameplay, and well, they'll probably hate what's been done with it, because it does just absolutely remove the strategic element. That's something they need to put back. It really is. So hopefully you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, you can do all the usual things down below, and as always, stay tuned for more.